Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those who are joining us from elsewhere outside the Philippines. So, welcome to the fourth Indigenous Studies lecture series. Um, we are co-hosting this event. This is, sorry, I'm Leia Abayao. I am from the Department of History and Philosophy of the College of Social Sciences. I'm the current dean of the college, and I wish to welcome everyone to the fourth Indigenous Studies lecture series, which we are co-organizing with MPSPC and the UP Diliman Asian Institute of Tourism. For the Indigenous Studies lecture series, we've been doing this for a while. We started in 2022 when we had the second visiting professor, Dr. Gomez, who did Indigenous Peace Ecology. And early this year, we had Una Paredes talk to us about knowledge production in Mindanao and relates to oral history and oral tradition. And then recently we had Dr. Ruth Lindaan, our very own faculty of the PhD Indigenous Studies program of UP Baguio, who shared with us her study and ongoing research on indigeneity and diaspora. So for this lecture series, we're moving to a different theme. We're happy to have another visiting professor share with us his expertise, and I will have my colleague and co-moderator, Dean Vanny Legaspi, to introduce the speaker in a while. But we've been eyeing our speaker since August, actually this year, but the schedule is quite tight as he was also teaching. And so we're very happy that we're able to get him to join the conversation on Indigenous Studies this evening. So we're 81 on Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have actually originally planned this for the Indigenous Studies students, but we thought that the conversation is important across the disciplines, and which is why we're also co-organizing this event with MPSPC and AIT. So I will now turn over to my co-moderator, Dean Vanny Legaspi. My co-moderator, Dean Vanny Legaspi, by the way, is so aside from he is the Dean of the Asian Institute of Tourism at UP Diliman, he's also finishing his PhD in Indigenous Studies in this program that we have at UP Baguio. His works are in the area of tourism. His works in tourism include corporate social responsibility, employment relations, human capital, and indigenous peoples. So on to you, Dean Vanny.
Thank you and good evening, Dean Leia. And of course, good morning to our speaker for tonight's and the fourth of the Indigenous Studies lecture series on Indigenous peoples and the 1972 World Heritage Conservation. As mentioned by Dean Leia, this is co-organized this is organized by the UP Baguio College of Social Sciences and in partnership with the Mountain Province State Polytechnic College and the UP Diliman Asian Institute of Tourism. I would like to first, before we hear to the talk of Professor Lenzerini, thank our participants here in Zoom. We have 81 at the moment. I hope that all those who have registered, we have about 300 plus participants who registered for this for the talk tonight. I hope they'll be able to join us later on. But just to mention a few, I hope I'll be able to give credit to those who have registered and who may already be here with us joining in Zoom from Biliran Province State University, Benguet State, from the different UP CUs, UP-LB, UP Baguio, UP Diliman, UP Visayas. We have as well a representative from Pakistan, from Rojas City, from Ateneo de Manila Senior High School, University of St. Louis, likewise in Zamboanga. Where else do we have? Of course, in Northern Province in CAR. Our partner, co-organizer here, the Mountain Province State Polytechnic College, Western Philippines University, Polytechnic University of the Philippines, University of Baguio, University of Cordillera, Ifugao State. We even have NGOs joining us, and likewise LGUs who are also with us here. We also would like to thank the participants. I think we are live streaming. And thank you for joining for our talk on Indigenous peoples in the 1972 World Heritage Conservation. So I will proceed with introducing our speaker. Federico Lenzerini is a professor of international law and human rights at the University of Siena in Italy. He is an expert in Indigenous peoples' heritage and in international law and human rights with multiple permanent and visiting academic positions. He has extensive experience working with both national governments and Indigenous communities at the national and transnational levels, including the UNESCO, the International Law Association, and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has been consultant to the UNESCO and counsel to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for international negotiations related to cultural heritage. He was the rapporteur of the International Law Association Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and rapporteur of the International Law Association Committee on the implementation of the rights of Indigenous peoples. A prolific scholar, Professor Lenzerini produced several publications, among them the most recent, in 2023, The Destruction of Indigenous Peoples' Heritage and International Law, the ILA Resolution number 5, and this is in 2012, and the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Situations of Pandemics, an old problem reappearing anew with COVID-19, Indigenous Cultural Heritage and International Law, Land, Culture, and Heritage, Restoring Indigenous Peoples' Cultural Identity Through Access to Justice and Reparations, the Role of the ILA in the Restatement and Evolution of International and National Law Relating to Indigenous Peoples, and a lot more. Okay, so without further ado, I would like to call on Professor Federico Lenzerini. Good morning, Professor Lenzerini.
Good evening to you, and thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor, it's a real pleasure to be with you. So first of all, I wish to thank you, Dean Legaspi and Dean Abayao, and all the organizers. I repeat that it is a real pleasure for me being with you. And of course, I want to thank also all of you who are present today, and I hope that we're gonna have a very fruitful discussion. The topic that has been assigned to me for today, as Dean Legazpi just said, is the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the 1972 World Heritage Convention. I suppose that you're all familiar with this convention, but just to be sure, I'm gonna share my screen right now to show you the most important part of the 1972 World Heritage Convention, which is the World Heritage List. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay. Can you see it? I suppose you can see. This is the page of the World Heritage List. The World Heritage List is a list of cultural and natural property established by the 1972 World Heritage Convention, which is the topic of our discussion, as I have just said. And you can see some numbers here. At present, there are virtually 1,200 properties inscribed on the list for all around the world, and 933 of them are cultural, so they're important for cultural reasons. 227 are natural and 39 are mixed. Mixed means that they are considered especially important for both cultural and natural reasons. This is one of the most successful international conventions ever. It was adopted in 1972, and it was not expected to have such a huge success. The reason of that is determined by the fact that the circumstance of having a number of properties inscribed on the World Heritage List gives a lot of visibility to states. And so most countries in the world are trying to have the highest possible number of properties located in the territory inscribed on the World Heritage List. If you scroll down the list, you can see that almost all countries in the world have properties inscribed on the list, of course, in a heterogeneous manner, because certain countries have been more committed than others to this convention since the beginning of its operation. If we go down to the Philippines, which is the country of most of you, I suppose, you can see that there are 6 properties inscribed on the list, 3 of cultural value and 3 of natural value. Let me just reach your country. Here you can see the list of the properties inscribed, and you can click on each of them. So there is a dedicated page, is this one that you certainly know much better than me, is the site of the Baroque churches of the Philippines. And the fact of having properties inscribed on the World Heritage List is an advantage for states, not only in terms of international visibility, but also for reasons of tourism and for reasons ultimately of financial income. For instance, I am among those people who, before visiting a country, take a look at this list to see what cultural and natural properties are inscribed, located in the territory of the country that I am about to visit, because this list is a sort of guarantee that the most important elements of culture and nature located in a given country are inscribed in that. And of course, the philosophy of the convention is to protect cultural and natural properties in the interest of the international community as a whole. But in reality, the territorial state retains full sovereignty on any property which is inscribed on the World Heritage List, to the point that if the state decides to develop a certain, for instance, economic or development activities on a site inscribed on the World Heritage List, the state concerned can do that, even to the prejudice of the integrity of the property. So basically, it is a convention which most of all allows states to increase their international visibility, not only in the context of interstate relations, but also with respect to the common people, because this is one of the very few international conventions of multilateral character, which is well known by common people as well. Maybe people do not know the technical details of this convention, but when you go to certain places and there is the emblem of the convention, we're used to say that this area is the property of UNESCO, which is not true technically. More correctly, it means that that particular area is inscribed on the World Heritage List to the benefits of the international community as a whole. So this was the introduction to the topic of our discussion. And we have to wonder, what is the situation of indigenous peoples in the context of this convention? Because sometimes when we deal with international law instruments, especially treaties, it may happen that there is a lack of an adequate connection between certain instruments. Because when a treaty is adopted, states parties normally try to implement the provisions of this treaty without taking care to the fact that this implementation may produce negative repercussions on other international values also protected by treaties and protected by customary international law as well, which, as you know, is a limited set of provisions that are of general applicability, and so they're binding for all countries in the world, irrespective of whether or not they have ratified the relevant treaties. So, the World Heritage Convention does not include any specific provision dealing with indigenous peoples and their rights. This is understandable, especially for the reason that in 1972, when the convention was adopted, basically there was not an adequate attention for the rights of indigenous peoples in the context of international law. So, of course, the provisions of the convention do not provide adequate protection or safeguarding for the rights of indigenous peoples. But it is a fact that in the implementing practice of the convention, it has a huge impact on the rights of indigenous peoples, and this impact is progressively growing, especially in consideration of the special significance of cultural heritage for and in the lives of indigenous peoples. In particular, the main problem is that the inscription of properties traditionally belonging to indigenous peoples on the World Heritage List and the subsequent management of these properties may raise a number of problematic issues that affect the rights of indigenous peoples and that today are not so satisfactorily addressed by the organs established by the World Heritage Convention. The main organ of the World Heritage Convention is the World Heritage Committee, which is an interstate body, intergovernmental body, which is composed by some of the states parties to the convention. Of course, there should be at least an equitable geographic distribution and also a rotation to allow sooner or later all states parties to the convention to become members of the World Heritage Committee. The World Heritage Committee gathers every year. It receives the nominations of state parties for inscription of properties on the World Heritage List and then decides whether or not a given property deserves to be inscribed on the list. Now, one notable feature of the World Heritage Convention is that it covers both cultural and natural properties. They are defined respectively, at Articles 1 and 2 of the Convention. And of course, it's easy to understand that cultural heritage, let us think about, for instance, paintings, elements of an archaeological nature, inscriptions, groups of buildings, works of human beings, etc., may well be the product of the cultural evolution of indigenous communities within their traditional territories. At the same time, natural properties may be located, and in many cases are actually located, in territories traditionally belonging to indigenous peoples. And so, when a property, including the traditional lands of an indigenous community, is inscribed on the World Heritage List without proper involvement of the indigenous community concerned and without properly considering the rights and interests of that community, it is clear that the consequences of the inscription can be really negative for the community concerned. At present, in the list, there are, dealing with natural properties, 227 of them, and probably for sure more than 100, but I suppose that we could say also 120, are of special significance for indigenous peoples. Let us think, for instance, to the Kakadu National Park in Australia, the Rapa Nui National Park in Chile, the Nahanni National Park in Canada, the Ken Krachan Forest in Thailand, and the Kenya Lake system in the Great Rift Valley, which is of special interest because, as we will see later, there has been a decision of a human rights bodies concerning exactly the inscription of this area on the World Heritage List and the rights of indigenous peoples. And when a territory of this kind is inscribed on the World Heritage List and indigenous communities are not adequately involved in the whole process of inscription and in the subsequent management of the property according to the rules of the World Heritage Convention, as I have already said, this may have detrimental consequences for them. There are different ways through which the operation of the World Heritage Convention can lead to the encroachment of indigenous people's rights. The most obvious one is when a state decides to propose the inscription of an indigenous territory on the World Heritage List without obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of the community concerned. Then there is also the opposite situation, when, of course, it is less frequent than the previous one, but it is still possible that an indigenous community would like to inscribe a property on the World Heritage List, a property, of course, of interest for the indigenous community concerned, and the government refuses to do that. Of course, we know that under the convention, the entity who has the discretion to decide whether or not a given property should be proposed for inscription on the World Heritage List is the government of the state concerned. But depending on the circumstances of each specific case and on the reasons determining the refusal to inscribe a property belonging to an indigenous community on the World Heritage List, this decision can translate into a form of discrimination against the indigenous community concerned. And in any event, probably the worst situation is determined by the exclusion of indigenous communities from the management of properties inscribed on the World Heritage List after their inscription. Of course, we're dealing with properties which are of special significance for indigenous peoples. Now, why the operation of the World Heritage Convention can be so problematic for indigenous peoples? First, it is the very structure of the convention, because it distinguishes between cultural and natural properties. And only, as we have seen in a very few cases, there is description of mixed properties. That is to say, areas, the significance of which is recognized under both the culture and the natural perspective contextually. So very often it happens that an area is inscribed as a natural property, so only taking into account its natural beauty and exceptional natural features, and the fact that the area can be of special cultural significance for indigenous peoples is sometimes ignored. And this, of course, has negative consequences, because the area is managed only taking into account its natural value without giving without recognizing appropriate significance to the cultural value this area has for indigenous peoples. And then there is the very parameter defining whether or not a given property deserves to be inscribed on the World Heritage List. In fact, this list is not open to all cultural and natural areas of the world, but is only reserved, as established by the convention itself, only to those properties who are of outstanding universal value. So, the significance of a property in the context of the implementation of the 1972 convention is only considered under a sort of objective perspective, in the sense that the property must have a value which can be perceived externally, something that is transmitted to the totality of the international community, who must be able to appreciate the exceptional significance of that area. And of course, this does not dedicate enough attention to the fact that in many cases an area can be of incredibly exceptional value for the indigenous communities living in the relevant territory, a value which, for a number of reasons, may not be perceived adequately by persons who are external to the community. Now, this requirement that properties inscribed on the World Heritage List are of outstanding universal value is interpreted by the operational document attached to the convention, which is the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, as meaning cultural and or natural significance, which is so exceptional as to transcend national boundaries and to be of common importance for present and future generations of all humanity. As such, the permanent protection of this heritage is of the highest importance to the international community as a whole. So you can understand again that this is based on a sort of objective, presumed objective perspective, like the subjective position of indigenous communities is totally ignored. The problem, it is that this concept is based on exterior values. So artistic, aesthetic, architectural, historical, or scientific significance. And there is no attention, again, for the spiritual link existing between certain communities, especially indigenous communities, and the lands concerned. So the value of traditional lands for indigenous peoples is basically ignored. There is no consideration for the fact that a given territory is considered the motherland where life originated and where all elements of life live today for certain indigenous communities. Due to this situation, several voices in the past few years have been raised in order to persuade the organs established by the World Heritage Convention, especially, as I told you earlier, the World Heritage Committee, to devote more attention to the specific needs of indigenous peoples through adopting changes to the criteria and regulations for the assessment of outstanding universal value, in order to interpret this requirement in a more subjective manner, not only through considering the objective perception of the significance of an area, but also to give adequate weight to the specific relationship existing between specific communities and the territories concerned. For instance, this was urged by the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples of the United Nations since 2015. And several other documents have been produced by different international bodies reiterating this request. We know that this is all the more necessary today in consideration of the contemporary developments of international law concerning indigenous people's rights. And of course, we can use as a parameter the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but we can even say that today there are certain rules of customary international law protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. And if the World Heritage Convention continues to be implemented as has been done so far, the system established by the convention is inconsistent with these rules of customary international law. And this is not correct under international law because there are rules concerning the interpretation of treaties which command states in the operation of a given treaty to take properly into account the existing provisions of customary international law which govern the same subject matter of the treaty. Now, in order to make the system of the World Heritage Convention fully consistent with the rights of indigenous peoples as developed to date in the context of international law, the ideal situation would be to introduce a requirement in the context of the operation of the convention, and this could be done in the operational document, that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, a requirement to obtain the consent of the indigenous communities concerned before inscribing a property of special significance for them on the World Heritage list. And the second necessary element that should be introduced in the system of the convention should consist in the guarantee that the indigenous communities concerned are fully involved in the management of the properties of special interest for them, which have been inscribed on the World Heritage list. Now, in very recent years, the World Heritage Committee has introduced a number of new provisions in the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention with the aim to increase the attention for the rights and needs of indigenous peoples in the context of the operation of the convention. But I could describe all these rules in details, but this would take a long time. What is important to emphasize is that there is the recognition that indigenous peoples should be considered as partners of states in the decisions concerning which properties should be inscribed on the World Heritage List, in the preparation of the inscription, and in the subsequent management of the property after its inscription on the list. There is the requirement that states should properly consult indigenous communities when, before deciding to propose a property of interest for them for the inscription on the World Heritage List. There are several provisions recently included in the operational guidelines recommending states to involve indigenous communities, concretely their representatives, in all the phases concerning the period prior to the inscription of a property on the list and the subsequent management. But the problem remains that all these activities can be done at the discretion of states. So it is necessary that a state is actually willing to involve an indigenous community in the management of a property inscribed in the World Heritage List. And there are some good examples of this cooperation between states and indigenous communities, but unfortunately, in most cases, governments tend to ignore the position, the needs, and the rights of indigenous peoples when proposing a given property for inscription on the World Heritage List. At the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned the property of the Kenya Great Lakes System, which is a wide area covering a territory composed of different lakes in the territory of Kenya. Now, in the context of this area, there is a portion of the land which is the traditional land of an indigenous community, the Endorois community living in Kenya. And it happened that the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which is the monitoring body having the competence to ascertain that the rules of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights are respected, the African Commission found that the inscription of this area of the World Heritage List without the proper involvement of the Endorois community, which not only was not involved, but was even evicted from its traditional lands because the state wanted to manage these lands at the central level consistent with the rules of the World Heritage Convention without involving the Endorois community in any way. And so the African Commission on Human and People's Rights found that this situation was totally inconsistent with international law concerning the rights of indigenous peoples, especially the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it found that the government of Kenya had violated a number of provisions of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So important human rights like the right to freedom of conscience and free practice of religion, because of course the community needs its traditional territories to practice its religion, and having been evicted, it was not possible any longer to exercise the right to religion, the right to property, the right to education, and the collective right of peoples to freely dispose of their wealth and natural resources, and the right of peoples to their economic, social, and cultural development. And of course, this is a situation which is quite frequent today because even in very recent years, certain areas belonging traditionally to indigenous communities have been inscribed on the World Heritage List, despite the fact that the World Heritage Committee was perfectly aware that the inscription would have resulted in the violation of the rights of local indigenous communities. But this situation has totally been ignored by the committee and the states parties to the convention. So, to conclude my presentation, it is true that some improvements have occurred in the context of the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, because at least finally the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, which I repeat is the operational document of the convention, finally has devoted attention to the rights of indigenous peoples. But the fact of whether or not this attention will translate into concrete measures in the context of the implementation of the convention is totally put to the discretion of states. And most states are not willing to consider the interest of indigenous peoples. So, of course, the situation is still ongoing. By the way, in January of 2024, in Geneva, there will be an important workshop involving the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the members of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the members of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and other international experts. And by the way, I have been invited to participate. And the purpose of this workshop should be to produce another document to be transmitted to the World Heritage Committee in order to reinforce the position of indigenous peoples in the context of the operation of the convention. But we have to keep in mind that the only adequate way to realize an appropriate attention, to guarantee an appropriate attention for the rights of indigenous peoples in the context of the World Heritage Convention would be to introduce the requirement that indigenous peoples give their prior free and informed consent before any kind of property which is of special interest for them is inscribed on the World Heritage List. And at the same time, it would be necessary that indigenous communities would be properly involved in the management of the properties after inscription. So I conclude my presentation for the moment, but of course, I'm very much willing to participate in the discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Federico. And truly, that is indeed a great importance, particularly looking at problematic issues on indigenous peoples and the World Heritage Conservation. Of course, this understanding and looking at ways on how we can define whether or not property should be ascribed as a World Heritage Site. And we need to adopt changes in criteria and assessment. And as shared by Professor Lenzerini, looking at adopting ways and changes in the criteria and assessment with the contentions and tensions and inconsistencies. And of course, as emphasized, we need to introduce a requirement that would consider the voice of indigenous peoples, and at the same time, the free prior informed consent, and looking at management that will be passed on for the World Heritage Sites, if and when the indigenous peoples and indigenous communities would agree to it. All right, so we proceed with introducing our reactor. So I may introduce them first. Dr. Mark Preston Lopez is an associate professor and the vice president for academic affairs at the Mountain Province State Polytechnic College. Thank you, Dr. Lopez, for joining us. And we have, of course, from the University of Philippines, Baguio, an associate professor of language and literature at the College of Arts and Communication. We have Dr. Ruth Tindaan. Good morning, Ma'am Ruth. And good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening, Penny and the participant.
Okay, shall I go first?
Yes, I'm assuming that Mark goes first.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much, Giovanni. And first off, I would like to thank the University of the Philippines, Baguio, for considering us to co-organize this important conversation. As I've said to Dean Leia, this is aligned to our mandates because MPSPC also continually works on Indigenous people's education, Indigenous knowledge and systems. No, so this is anchored to the mandates that we have in MPSPC. Yeah, so thank you, Federico, for this engaging presentation on the World Heritage Convention and also touching on, Indigenous people's rights, on their natural and cultural properties. Okay, so I think in post-colonial conversations, Indigenous peoples, are perceived as subalterns, no, where their voices, their narratives, their discourses are not not often given enough space in mainstream conversation. Um, in fact, while conversations on IP rights have recently emerged, no, in the academe, okay, I think this space is not yet sufficient because majoritarian narratives still focus on the economic and the political aspects of these conversations. So I think my role as a reactor is perhaps make this connection between your presentation and academic institutions in general. So for me, I think educational institutions would serve as spaces for critical conversations on the rights of Indigenous peoples in terms of the management and you know the supervision of these World Heritage sites that are within their domains, their ancestral domains, so we say, no. Um, I just have one question before I end with my reaction. Perhaps, Federico, how do you think could national and local governments could genuinely engage Indigenous peoples in terms of the conversations on managing the preservation of this World Heritage sites and in the planning process, maybe participatory planning in terms of the inscription of their natural and cultural properties. So are there concrete examples of how IPs, Indigenous peoples, really are engaged in these processes?
Should I ask the question right now?
Yes, I think
I don't
yes.
know what do we what's for
Ma'am Leia.
do we have Federico answer or I'll go first?
Whichever works well for Federico. If you want to answer right away, I think that's okay.
Yes,
Okay,
probably,
okay.
probably now.
It's the same for me, as you prefer.
Probably engage with the question first so we won't forget about it.
Yes.
Okay, okay. Well, this is a very good question because the problem is that in many cases it is very difficult to understand whether a given Indigenous community has been properly involved, in the management of a situation of this kind. For instance, in the context of the World Heritage Convention, as I said, there are good examples. There is a site, the first which comes to my mind is about a site inscribing Greenland, in the context of which the local indigenous communities were involved since the beginning in the nomination process, and they're involved also in the subsequent management of the property. But probably this is due to the fact that Greenland is an area in which the presence and the exercise of power as well is concentrated very often in the hands of indigenous peoples for a number of issues. So it is a place where this kind of situation was more favorable than in the majority of countries in the world. But these good examples are quite limited, especially for the fact that sometimes states declare that they have properly involved indigenous communities, but it is hard to prove that this really happened. And in order to make this clearer, I would like to make reference to another UNESCO convention, which is the 2003 Convention on the Safeguarding of the Intangible Cultural Heritage, which is about the immaterial portion of cultural heritage. So in some way, it completes the protection established by the 1972 Convention. And according to the operational directives to the Intangible Heritage Convention, there is actually a requirement for states to obtain the free, prior, and informed consent of an indigenous community before proposing an element of intangible heritage to be inscribed on the list established by the convention. But in most cases, the problem in the practice is determined by the fact that states present these documents, written documents signed by somebody, claiming that, okay, this is the consent of the local community. But nobody is able to prove that this consent was really given by the community, was really given by the representatives of the community, and whether or not the person who signed the document was in the position of representing the community in that particular case. So basically, it is a very complicated situation. And in my opinion, it would be necessary that, first of all, states should try to concretely engage indigenous communities, first of all, trying to understand their point of view and their perception of the issue. And this should be shown with respect to all phases of the procedure leading to the inscription of the property on the World Heritage List. So it should be something very visible at the international level in order to demonstrate that the involvement was true, was genuine. Because sometimes, I repeat, this is the main problem. So even the existence of a requirement to obtain the consent of an indigenous community may not be sufficient in practice.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I really agree with these things that are happening. They are not concrete in terms of their participation in this engagement. Thank you so much, Federico.
Many thanks to you.
Thank you, Federico. It's my turn. What strikes me with the discussion that you presented is the idea that there is great emphasis on the convention in relation to what you call the universal values, considering the value of these properties to generally humanity, not in relation to the subjective importance of this on the ground, which of course is something of contradictory concern for Indigenous studies, because in Indigenous studies you always have great emphasis on local context and always historicize with specific circumstances. So the sort of contrast is really striking in this convention. And I think it's similar with the inconsistencies in international law, which you mentioned in relation to the provisions which are not consistent with other conventions. But I was happy to hear about the introduction of new provisions in which indigenous studies can be indigenous peoples can be included, like seeking consent and involvement with management of properties. And I guess for us indigenous who are engaged in indigenous studies, or for indigenous students, I'm looking at these newly introduced provisions as opportunities in which we may become involved. So probably we may become involved in, for instance, the management of these properties, for example, especially because we have one in the Cordillera. And it's not only the actual resource management of these properties, but because I'm in the arts and communication field, I'm thinking about how can we be involved in how these properties are being represented, and what images are being produced and circulated about these properties, and what is the narrative that is being told about these heritage places or properties. So I think maybe research directions can go in that area. My question with Federico might be about the relationship of these heritage places with tourism, because you said earlier that every time you go to a country, you look up what their properties are listed in this particular list that you've showed us. I'm interested in your thoughts about the sort of balance between the idea of conservation of these heritage places versus the touristic value of these properties, which is really to generate income for the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a huge problem indeed. First of all, I would like to emphasize, just to clarify, that personally I have always criticized in my writings the requirement of the outstanding universal value. Unfortunately, it is there in the definition of cultural and natural heritage, and that is the parameter which was introduced in the convention in order to distinguish between properties which deserve inscription from the generality of cultural and natural property. Now, the issue of tourism is particularly controversial because, of course, for indigenous peoples, in some cases, of tourism can be a source of income, and so it can be very useful for them. But at the same time, mass tourism can destroy their values, especially for the reason that sometimes tourists pretend that certain cultures, I would say, generally speaking, are adapted to what they expect. And so in some cases, indigenous communities are forced to adapt their cultural practices to what tourists expect from them. And of course, this is a huge problem for the cultural integrity and identity of indigenous communities. As a tourist, I normally tend not to visit areas where the rights of indigenous peoples are not properly respected. But this is something which is hard to pretend from the generality of tourists. The word which is very popular today, the expression which is very popular today, is that of sustainable tourism. But the problem is, when is tourism sustainable, especially in areas which are of special importance for indigenous communities? Well, the only solution, in my opinion, would be that indigenous communities themselves would manage tourism in their area of importance in a way that they consider appropriate for the preservation and the transmission to future generations of their cultural identity and integrity. On the one hand, in my opinion, it would be wrong to say that we should not promote tourism in areas belonging to indigenous peoples, because indigenous cultures, and correct me if I'm wrong, of course, like any other cultural models, are in constant evolution. And so indigenous communities in most cases tend to to have the desire to be involved with tourists and to use the opportunities offered by tourism. But at the same time, we need to avoid that uncontrolled tourism will result in the encroachment of indigenous people's rights. And since, I mean, I'm working in the field of indigenous people's rights and with indigenous people since many years, but I'm still a student in this respect because I'm still trying to learn many things about the conception of life of indigenous peoples. And so nobody, this is to say that nobody can pretend to know the way how the interest of indigenous peoples should be managed. Only indigenous peoples themselves know how to deal with their interest and to manage them. So, of course, with the inscription of a property on the World Heritage List, in most cases, there will be an increment of tourism because that area will become popular for the majority of people in the world. And this is exactly a key aspect of the management in the context of which the involvement of indigenous communities should be raised at the maximum level. I would say that only the indigenous communities should manage this aspect and decide how tourism should be regulated. This is my opinion, of course.
Thank you, Federico. So I'm okay. Thank you.
All right. Mhm.
Thank you, Dr. Ruth and Dr. Mark. I think, Dinglea, we have a question in the chat box. If I may read it.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a message, a question from Jess Dasilio. I hope I pronounced the last name correctly. The World Heritage says that the Aita or Agta Isarog language in Kamsur, and this is in the Bicol province or region, is dying and will soon become extinct. So what to do with this? Should people outside the Agta Isarog community like that, the national government care at all? Should academicians and indigenous peoples advocates or advocacy groups reach out to the community or wait for the community to assist them in preserving their language? So if the community doesn't want to be helped with, does that mean that it's okay for them that their language disappears for good? So this seems to be the impression of Jess Desilio. So you have any response to that, Professor Federico, or our reactor as well, Dr. Mark or Dr. Ruth? Which is a very interesting question indeed, yes. So how do we proceed, or how do we consider?
May I?
Yes, yes, please. Yes.
Well, it is indeed a very interesting question. Thank you for that. Now, when talking about a language, we refer more to an immaterial element of a heritage, so an intangible element. The problem is that I participated in negotiations for the 2003 Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, and the majority decided not to include language as such in the definition of intangible heritage. So this particular element, which is fundamental in the context of the life of any community, not only indigenous communities, is not protected by the 1972 convention because it is limited to tangible heritage, and it is not protected by the Intangible Heritage Convention as well, because in that convention, language is only protected as a vehicle of other elements of immaterial heritage, of intangible heritage. So, then nevertheless, relying on UNESCO convention would not be the only way of protecting indigenous people's cultural heritage, because language is definitely an element of cultural heritage. There are a number of provisions, for instance, in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples also specifically dealing with language which can be used. And anybody can contribute to this fight to preserve the language of an indigenous community. Of course, academicians, because our role is to disseminate information, no? And I think that it is important to create an awareness of concerning the importance to protect a given value. Common people as well, the authorities, because sometimes the main problems concerning the protection of the rights of indigenous peoples is simply determined by the fact that indigenous peoples are not allowed to protect their rights because they're perfectly capable to do that alone without any need to be helped by external people. The problem is that external people place obstacles to the normal course of life of indigenous people. So basically, in my opinion, what law should do for indigenous peoples is simply to create conditions for them to live the way they want to live without external interferences. I'm not sure that they will be able to protect their heritage in the best possible way. Otherwise, it would be paternalistic to think that indigenous peoples need our help to protect their rights. They don't need our help because they know very well how to conduct their life. Of course, in order to protect the language, it is necessary that the community is willing to do that. If the current members of the community are not interested in preserving their language, that would be a problem, because that would be paternalistic as well, in my opinion. We cannot force a community to keep an element of the heritage because we like it if they don't want to maintain it as part of their life. But I'm sure that most indigenous communities are very willing to preserve the elements of their cultural heritage, including their language. And I suppose, I don't know this case in details, but I suppose that also this community is willing to preserve its language.
All right. Let me read this, Vani. There's a
Yeah.
question. I don't know. I think it would be a good rejoinder to what you just said, Federico. So there's this note. How do we develop organic intellectuals from the ranks of indigenous communities? I believe that this is a critical, this is critical in the interanimating processes of democratization and decolonization. I don't know if you want to answer that, Federico, or any thoughts on that. So I'm reading via the Q&A. There's some aspects in there, although we have like 11 questions. You can also choose which one in there would you like to answer. And then we actually have raised hands. We have from Rachel Gimbatan, who might like to join the conversation and would like to ask some questions as well later when you'd like to answer this.
I would like to answer any question. It depends on you. I mean, which one you want me to answer.
Okay, this one about intellectuals, indigenous intellectuals. Would you want to comment on that?
Excuse me, because there is one in the chat, or
sorry, it's in the Q&A. I'll just read. How do you
okay.
How do we develop organic intellectuals from the ranks of indigenous communities? I believe that this is critical in the interanimating processes of democratization and decolonization.
Well, yes, not easy to answer. In my opinion, this is very important, but it depends on what we mean for intellectuals. I one thing I have learned is that the most successful indigenous communities, and the first example which comes to my mind is the example of the Maori people in New Zealand, with which I have interacted some time ago. The most successful indigenous communities are those who have learned how to use the methods and the life schemes of the Western world at the service of their rights.
Yeah.
So this can be a way to intend the word intellectual, in my opinion, learning how to use the models that we like it or not, are predominant in a given society, and to adapt these models in order to recover certain rights of indigenous communities. The Maori people, through this kind of method, have been able to obtain the return of some meaningful parts of their traditional lands, for instance. But intellectual can also be intended, in my opinion, as persons who are able to teach the dominant society indigenous values and what means to be indigenous, in order to introduce the indigenous discourse within the management of the society. And I would be in favor of this kind of approach, because we are talking about law, of course, but law is based on the experiences of life. And at least in my case, I have become passionate for indigenous peoples for two reasons, basically. First, because I felt a sort of responsibility as a Western person for what my society did to indigenous peoples for centuries. And second, because in indigenous life, there is a beauty which cannot be found, in my opinion, in any other model of life around the world. There is a beauty in the construction of the relationship between the human community and the rest of the elements which share the world with us, and not only the world, because we talk so much about spirituality. So being an intellectual in this case means that you are able to transmit to the others the indigenous values. And in order to raise intellectuals within indigenous communities, of course, it is necessary to know what being indigenous means, especially in the context of the relevant community, but also to know how this kind of message can be conveyed to the rest of the society. And I'm afraid that this can only be done through knowing the models of relations existing in the dominant society. So an indigenous intellectual, in my opinion, is somebody who knows what it means to be indigenous and who knows how it is possible to translate these into words that are understandable to the dominant society.
Wow.
I
Wow.
don't know whether I have properly answered to your question.
Wow, that's interesting. That's very warming to hear from you on that note. Yeah, but so I was just talking to Invani, and I think we have a raised hand from one of our participants, so we'll allow Rachel Gimbatan Fadias to speak.
Yeah, yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Go ahead, Rachel.
Uh,
Yes, your question.
okay, yeah, yeah. It's not a question. It's just really a reaction to. Um, I'm sorry I cannot show my face. I'm not sure of the strength of the connection here. First of all, let me thank the speaker, Federico, for sharing us your expertise and thoughts on what's happening and updates on World Heritage um, Convention. What do you call this? The updates on the policies that are being done today. My name is Rachel Gimbatan Fajas. I'm sharing to you from experience. I've been a World Heritage Site Manager for the Philippine Rice Terraces for over 15 years. Um, I was involved in education and as an architect and an environmental planner myself. I was involved in land use, community land use planning, and doing some building zoning policies with the communities, with indigenous peoples themselves, as I'm also an indigenous person. So I agree with Federico when he mentioned that being intellectual means being able to express indigenous values and thoughts to the dominant society. That's I was about to say you should know how you have that ability to be bilingual, and therefore that's important. Anyway, so I'm sharing this as a question for everyone to think about. I have been working in with the communities within the World Heritage sites. And the main complaint, not really the main complaint, but the main conflict is between their desire for their development. You know, they have aspirations also. So there is this question on what governs decisions related to development. World Heritage Site protection means you are putting restrictions on the area, and you are subjecting the indigenous communities living in that area, for instance, in cultural landscapes. You are subjecting the communities to abide by the policies of protecting that area because it is a World Heritage Site. Now, on indigenous rights for development, supposing they say, oh, we want to build a swimming pool in the core area of the Philippine rice terraces. Which should govern this? Should it be their aspiration, their desire, their right for their own development? Or the conventions of World Heritage. So these are questions. This is just one example, but these are one of the many questions that we face when we work with communities on introducing or maybe guiding them uh, to come up with plans, sustainable plans to maintain the World Heritage sites. It's just an addition, a reaction. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Um, and perhaps even continuing with the question from Carmen, I think this is also in a way related. Would Carmen want to ask the question directly to Professor Federico? Carmen, you can unmute, please.
Hi. Hi. I hope I'm audible. So, good evening, good morning, Professor Federico. Thank you once again for sharing with us your wisdom. From a legal standpoint, it's always very refreshing to look at issues from different perspectives. I typed in my questions. So, I guess my first question has something to do with the consent and the assertion of indigenous peoples. So, are there any particular cases where indigenous peoples rejected the nomination of their host states of cultural properties of these communities and they've succeeded in this rejection? Because, from my understanding of what you shared with us today, even if the communities say no, it's still mediated by states. And then my second question is it has something to do with indigenous communities against indigenous communities. So can Indigenous communities take legal action against other Indigenous communities occupying the same territory within the same state? Can they use the convention to, say, dispute actions made by other Indigenous communities with regard to cultural properties that are being considered for heritage, quote unquote, protection or uh, declaration?
Thank you, Carmen. Yes, Professor Federico, any response to the question of Carmen?
Thank you very much. I'm really impressed by the quality of your questions. And professors should never say that. You know that one of our common approaches is you never disclose that question by somebody is creating difficulties for you to answer. No, you have never to show that, because you always have to show that you know everything, and you always have dominance on each kind of topic. But I think I can answer to these questions anyway. The question by Rachel, first of all, sorry if I mispronounce your name, is very interesting. There is in international law, there is an order of importance of the values which should be protected. In practice, the problem is that sometimes the practice does not respect this order of importance for the very simple reason, which is disappointing for us. The states have certain priorities, and so they are much more interested in their international visibility than in respecting the human rights of their people. But of course, in the context of the management of a World Heritage property, the interest of indigenous communities should definitely come first, then the proper implementation of the convention, especially because there is nothing wrong, according to the convention, in implementing the rules of the convention itself, and so in managing a World Heritage property consistent with the needs of local communities. And I don't think that there can be practical cases in the context of which giving priority to the interest of an indigenous communities, even interest to development, as you said, would be against the World Heritage Convention, because indigenous communities, in my opinion, are those who, more than any other community, are able to guarantee the preservation of the integrity of a cultural and natural property. And the main purpose of the World Heritage Convention is exactly to guarantee the preservation of the integrity of a property which is inscribed on the list. Normally, the development of indigenous communities is always conducted in a way which is sustainable and respectful of the integrity of a natural area in particular, and never brings to the destruction of that area. And in any event, even supposing that there could be a conflict between the developmental interest of indigenous peoples and the preservation of the area under the World Heritage Convention, we are talking about human rights. We are talking about the legitimate interest of an indigenous community, like any other human community, to improve the quality of its life and its existence, which can have important consequences in terms also of the fundamental human rights of its members. And so, in my opinion, this should prevail. Then I have to admit that my approach is very oriented towards the rights of indigenous peoples. So in some cases, it may happen that I'm not really objective, but of course I'm trying to evaluate your question under a purely legal point of view, and I could reach the same conclusion even if the community concerned would not be an indigenous community, but another kind of human community. As regards the questions by Carmen, normally, as I said, the indigenous peoples are not allowed to stop the process of inscription of a property on the World Heritage List. So basically, it depends on the government. If the government is so open-minded to accept that it will go to stop the process of inscription because the local indigenous communities does not have the desire that the property is inscribed, this may happen. But again, the decision is at the discretion of the government, and so indigenous communities do not have much power, except in some countries, which are very few in the world, but some countries have domestic legislation according to which, before proposing a property for inscription on the World Heritage List, it is necessary to obtain the consent of the indigenous community. In that particular case, for instance, this happens in the United States, but only as regards those areas which are qualified by law as tribal areas. But in any way, this law exists. If I'm not wrong, another country with a similar law is Brazil, for instance. In these cases, then an indigenous community can stop the process of inscription of a property on the World Heritage List, simply not giving the consent. Then the problem remains of being sure that the consent is genuine, is given by the right persons, and really represents the will of the community, which is another issue. Then, can you please remind me your second question?
My second question has to do with whether or not indigenous communities can use the convention to take legal action against other communities within the same
Okay. Yes, this could be done, especially in some countries. The first country which comes to my mind in this respect is Australia, because the High Court of Australia has attributed much importance to the World Heritage Convention. And of course, this can be an argument that an indigenous community can use against another indigenous community if the use of the territory is not consistent with the needs of protection established by the convention. If I was the lawyer of the community, I would insist probably on other arguments, especially human rights and the protection of the cultural identity or integrity of the community. But certainly, this is an additional argument which can be used, in my opinion. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much.
All right. I think there's a related question to that on the UNESCO, the role of UNESCO. Sorry. Can you read that, Bunny? Sorry.
I have the same problem. When you see that I deactivate my camera, it's because I have to cough.
Sorry.
Yes. I think the question here is, as mentioned by Dinley, what is the role or responsibility of UNESCO or other international bodies in addressing the issues you mentioned earlier? And especially since not all countries implement the convention or subscribe to the convention or the declaration. So how can this be enforced by the different international organizations? I think this is with respect to the indigenous people's interest.
Well, many of the important developments occurred in the context of the rights of indigenous peoples have actually occurred in the context of international organizations. If we think about the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations, and that was a particular case because, as you know, indigenous representatives were involved in the negotiations. This is the reason why many provisions of the declaration are actually responsive to the needs of indigenous peoples. But there is also always to be considered that international organizations are in the hands of states. So important decisions must be taken with the consent of states. Otherwise, it is not possible to do anything which is of significance. Of course, in the context of an international organization, it may happen that a state is persuaded to take a position which is not so against the rights of indigenous peoples due to the positive influence of a general discussion in the context of which we are trying to promote the development of certain rights. And even countries which are not very democratic, let us say, in the context of the discussions of taking place within international organizations like UNESCO or the United Nations, are sometimes forced to take a position which is not so strongly against the rights of indigenous peoples as they do internally. But I repeat, the problem remains that governments must be persuaded to promote the rights of indigenous peoples, because in the end are the governments which decide. If we take the changes to the operational guidelines for the implementation of the World Heritage Convention, the reason why so far a requirement that the free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous communities concerned is obtained as a precondition for the inscription of a property on the World Heritage List has not been included in the guidelines is because in order for a rule of this kind to be included, it is necessary that it is approved by the committee, and the committee is composed by state representatives. So we need to have the consent of states. But, and I conclude on this point, in the past few years, states have accepted positions that 10 years ago or 15 years ago could not even be imagined. Just think about the voting process of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You know that in 2007, when the declaration was voted, there were only 4 votes against the declaration. But by states with a huge weight, like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. But what is significant is that by 2011, so in only 4 years, these 4 countries all reversed their position concerning the declaration and officially endorsed, approved the declaration. In Canada, a country which voted against the declaration, last year, a law was adopted incorporating the old declaration in the domestic law of the country. So this means that the process of development of the rights of indigenous peoples is running quite fast. And in my opinion, this is the good part of the issue, because states, probably because they're forced, we don't know, but states are accepting rules that until a few years ago could not be even imagined that this could be done. I remember that when we started the work for the Convention on the Intangible Cultural Heritage in 2001, somebody suggested to include in the preamble a reference to indigenous peoples. It was 2001, so only about 20 years ago. And somebody from the Secretariat of UNESCO said, this will never be accepted. And from that time, many things have changed.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Professor Federico. Yeah, I would like to inform or remind everyone, all the participants, to please take time to answer the evaluation form. So the link is on the chat box. So please answer the evaluation form, and after which your e-certificates will be given to you. All right. In the interest of time, perhaps we can have one last question, Dilea.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Um, Perhaps on a lighter note, but something that is also quite popular and something that affects us all would be um, a question in the Q&A box. So what could be the role of vloggers in general in protecting the cultural heritage while popularizing them? I think this is really something that has emerged and shown some important effect and affecting perceptions and ideas, particularly among tourists, non-tourists, people, indigenous and non-indigenous as well. So any response to this, Professor Federico?
Excuse me, what is the role of what?
The vloggers.
Bloggers.
Yeah, that's right. So in the context
Well,
of, go ahead, T, sorry.
I have to confess that this is the first time that I received this kind of question, but it's interesting anyway. Well, I think that today in the era of mass communication, anybody can have a role. And if there is a way to disseminate certain information, even if you're able to reach only a few persons, that would be valuable, because it is the very well-known sentence by Mother Teresa di Calcutta that the ocean is made up of drops, no? And so anybody can give a contribution in the context of his or her activity. And so I think that nobody should think that, well, I cannot do anything in this context, because this is not true. Even if you're able to determine an awareness in one single person on the importance of the rights of indigenous peoples and on the approach that should be followed, that would be important.
All right. Yes. Thank you, Federico. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we could still accommodate one last question. I think Mac Laba, is that right? Mac?
Maki Lakbawan.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's okay. Yeah, so Maki Lakbawan is actually co-teaching a course with me on Indigenous Studies, Indigenous Studies 302, and that's Indigenous Knowledge. And if Maki could quickly send in or ask his question, and then we give it the time for Federico to respond.
Yeah. Ma'am Leia, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk, Professor Lenzerini. I'm sorry I could not show my face. I'm also in a public event. Yeah, so your remarks about indigenous visibility in the convention are somewhat dependent to the state it's true. It somehow re-echoes, I think, a larger trend in the practice of rights, wherein for a man to appear for a man to be legally recognized, one has to be part, say, for example, a political community. And this, I think, of course, re-echoes a long-running critique by Hannah Arendt on the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Human. For a person to appear as someone with rights, that person should be, in a way, part of a political community or a sovereign. And this, for me, captures the predicaments of indigenous communities, not only in the Philippines, but I think the rest of the world. to be indigenous communities should wait because their recognition, their visibility still depends on whether or not they belong to, say, a political community to be part of a sovereign state. And this makes indigenous communities somewhat, if you can use the phrase, occupant in the waiting room of democracy or in the waiting room of history. So indigenous communities should wait before the state, for the state to somehow give them permission to be visible. That's just my first the first comment. My second comment, it's not really a question, but and not a criticism, but in the interest of conversation, you said one way to deal with the problem posed by the convention is that there should be FPIC. Indigenous communities should still engage and voice out their concerns. But I really don't know to what extent can that really affect the convention, because as you said earlier, the convention operates on externalities and external qualities, for example, religious, aesthetics, and scientific. And these are the criteria for judging whether or not a property, an indigenous land could become, quote unquote, a heritage. And I really don't know whether FPIC could answer to these externalities, because yes, communities could voice their concern, they could still talk, but still the externalities, the operating guidelines remain the same. So you have communities, suppose they agree to be recognized, their property should be recognized, but still they are recognized according to externalities, to prerequisites that are still outside and not representative of indigenous, I don't know, conception of property, conception of land, conception of nature. So I wonder how really does FPIC challenge or open an avenue for indigenous communities to, push the boundary further of the convention if the convention remains operating on the same set of external prerequisites. Thank you.
Right. Would you have any response to the comment and the question of Matt? Professor
Yes,
Federico?
I understand very well your point of view. As regards the fact that indigenous people should wait, if I understood correctly, because their voice did not arrive very, very clear, but I think I understood your points. Well, I don't know whether personally I agree, because while they're waiting, they lose important parts of their identity and of their culture. I agree, on the contrary, on the fact that they should try to be engaged in the political management of the state, and that would be probably the best way to have really a strong voice to be used also in the context of the operation of the World Heritage Convention. As regards the second points, what you say is true, but at the same time, the convention is based on legal concepts, and the legal concepts by their own nature are abstract, and they can be interpreted. They need to be interpreted, and they can be interpreted in different ways. And in reality, partially, this has already happened in the context of the World Heritage Convention, because this concept of outstanding universal value, which of course remains, and you're perfectly right, but today is interpreted in a slightly different way than in the past, at the beginning of the operation of the convention. And certainly, outstanding universal value could be understood as incorporating also the specific value that a given property has for a given community. Because in the end, today, the international community is valuing, for instance, cultural diversity. And cultural diversity is considered a value which enriches humanity as a whole. But cultural diversity is made up of the sum of the different individual cultural models existing in the world. So having outstanding universal value, especially the word universal, could also be considered in a way which incorporates this pluralism of culture as a value of universal importance for the international community. So basically, through this evolutionary interpretation, it would be possible to incorporate indigenous concepts within the convention. Then, of course, certain problems would remain, and only with the passing of time they could be properly addressed. The fact that the leading actors would be anyway states and would remain states, but this is not only a problem existing for the World Heritage Convention, but it is inherent in the very structure of international law and international treaties in particular. The problem would remain that it would be necessary to ensure that free, prior, informed consent would be real and would be really representative of the community, as we have already said several times. But of course, we cannot think that we would solve all the problems in 1 minute. It's a process which has already started and now needs to be consolidated, because it is indispensable that certain commitments which are left to the discretion of the state would be little bit stronger in the context of the operation of the convention. And this is what we hope to achieve for the future. Thank you anyway for all your questions, which were so interesting, and I would stay many hours to discuss with you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Federico. Yes, I think we come to an end, but before that, can we request all the participants on Zoom to open their videos or cameras for a group photo? If you could. Thank you. And perhaps
Billy will give us a cue for a group photo.
Sure, ma'am.
Okay.
We have 4 pages of participants, so keep on smiling, I guess. Okay, here's for the first slide. 1, 2, 3. Oh, wait, sorry. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay, for the second slide. Smile, 1, 2, 3. Okay, third. 1, 2, 3. Smile po. And sa last slide naman po. 1, 2, 3. Ayan po. Salamat po.
Thank you so much.
Yes, yeah. Any before we end, any closing message?
Thank you, everyone, and most especially to you, Federico. It's been like 2 hours now in conversation with you, and your thoughts and answers to the questions, reflection points are important to us. And thank you, everyone, for your questions and responses to the lecture of Federico. We invite you again to another lecture next time. We announce it on our a Facebook page and website. So please join us in conversation about Indigenous studies and Indigenous peoples. And yeah, if you're interested, we have a PhD in Indigenous studies to a graduate program to join in and learn more on these types. Federico has taught in the program, and who knows, he might teach again. We'll see. We invite him again to do such. So thank you so much, Federico, and thank you so much, Dean Vani, Ruth, VP Mark. Thank you for joining us and doing all our parts to make this interesting and the conversation we've had today. Thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, Federico will get in touch with you again. We're sorry that we cannot answer all the questions, but feel free to communicate with us. And who knows, even Dean Vani or Ma'am Ruth, Sir Mark will be able to answer this, not just Federico, because we are all thinking about all these questions.
Okay, with that, thank you, Dean Leia. Thank you, Dr. Mark, Dr. Ruth, and Professor Federico, and to all participants in tonight's lecture series on Indigenous peoples and the 1972 World Heritage Conservation. And
Thank
see
you. It was my
Oh, yeah.
pleasure, my real pleasure spending some time with you. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No worries. Thank you very much. And see you all in the next lecture series of the Indigenous Studies program of UP Baguio College of Social Science. Thank you, and
Thank you.
good evening, everyone.
Thank you so much on behalf of MPSPC.
Thank you.
Thank you, Federico. It's nice to meet you.
My pleasure. My real pleasure. Thank you.
See you next time.
Salamat po.
Thank you, Manny.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.